on our museum website. So if you do miss a portion of the presentation or want to review it, definitely check back on our website, ncmaritimemuseumbeaufort.com. It's under the tab that says Museum at Home. And that's also where you'll find a lot of the other videos of presentations that have already been recorded. So we are now live through Facebook. We are now recording. So David, I will hand over the reins to you.
All right, thank you, Christine. And hi, my name is David Bennett. I'm the curator of maritime history with the North Carolina Maritime Museum System. And today I'm going to be talking about the shad and herring fisheries of the Albemarle region. So I'm going to be talking about the Albemarle Sound as well as the tributaries that lead into the Sound. So first off, the Albemarle Sound is bordered by 9 different counties. It's in the northeastern part of the state. You have Bertie County, Chowan, Perquimans, Pasquotank, Camden, Currituck, Dare, Terrell, and Washington counties. And so the fish, of course, that we're talking about, the shad and the herring, there's staple parts of the diet for people within North Carolina for a very long time. The shad later on was iced and could be sent north where it fetched a good price at market. And then the herring was usually salted, and it was consumed domestically in North Carolina, but it was also sold within Virginia as well. Now, both of these fish, they spend most of their lives in the ocean, in the salt water. But starting in March, starting in the early spring, they make their ways back into the inland waters where they spawn and reproduce in the freshwater rivers and creeks of North Carolina, as well as other states along the eastern seaboard. And so we're going to start off with the colonial era in North Carolina. This is really when these fisheries start. Mark Catesby, who was a British naturalist traveling through North Carolina in the early 18th century, observed the herring, and he wrote, "Herrings in March leave the salt waters and run up the rivers and shallow streams of fresh water in such prodigious shoals that people catch them on shore with shovels." So these fish were so numerous that people could just dip a shovel into a river or into the Sound and just scoop fish out. And the earliest so with this talk, we're predominantly going to be discussing the large hull seines, which are just big nets that were used to catch these fish. And the earliest recorded hull seines in the region were owned by John Campbell and Richard Brownrigg. John Campbell lived in what's today Bertie County, and Richard Brownrigg lived in Chowan County, direct opposite sides of the Chowan River. And in the 1740s, they set up probably the first commercial fishing operation in that part of the state. And really, this is the first major recorded commercial fishing enterprise in North Carolina. And so we don't know exactly what their seine would have looked like, but this is what an 18th century seine looked like for shad. And it's you probably used a couple of boats to take it out in the Sound and then pay it out and then tow it back to shore where the fish were landed. And then there's a French traveler who was passing through North Carolina in 1765, and he wrote, "This evening went to see the heron fishing. In an hour's time, they catched about 100 barrels with quantity of rocks, white perch, and several other sorts." And this is one of the first written accounts of what it was like at the Brownrigg fishery in Chowan County. And so during this time period, during the colonial era, most of these fisheries are focused on the rivers of the region. You've got a lot of rivers and creeks, and it was thought that it was going to be a lot easier and a lot safer to fish on the rivers, because when storms and high winds come through the Albemarle Sound, it can get kind of rough out there, and people were hesitant to try and venture out into the Sound at first. Plus, the rivers and creeks are narrower, and you don't need you need a good sized net, but you don't need a huge net to get a lot of fish. And so when these fish were caught, they were salted and put in barrels, and they're shipped out of Edenton. And the shad and the herring went to other North American colonies. They went to Europe. They went to the Azores. They went to the Canary Islands and even the West Indies. And so I'm just going to, just real quickly, if there's any sort of questions right now, I don't know if there would be, but do we have anything, Christine?
David, I have not seen anything, but we did have a few people
Okay.
join us. For those of you that have joined us after the start, we are going to be monitoring the chats, the chat feature on the Zoom presentation and the comments made on the Facebook Live presentations. So if you have any questions or comments for David, we ask that you put them into those chats and I'll monitor them. And then when these question slides come up throughout the presentation, we'll then relay those comments and questions on to David.
All right.
Thank you
Good.
very much.
So now we're going to jump into the Antebellum period, and this is the era in which these fisheries really start to take off. So during this time period, you're really seeing a more defined fishing season of March to May for the shad and herring. It's also becomes, so just about everyone in eastern North Carolina, especially the northeastern part of the state, is consuming salted shad and herring. However, during the Antebellum period, there's a growth in the enslaved population in North Carolina to support plantation work, and it's a cheap food source, the shad and the herring, and it's also extremely high in protein, which is needed to keep people healthy. Excess herring was often used as fertilizer on farms. And then, so during the Antebellum period, fishermen are starting to venture out into the Albemarle Sound. By 1847, there's 25 fisheries on the Albemarle Sound. So one of the earliest recorded ones is Eden House, and it was owned by Joseph Skinner in 1807. And technically, I kind of see it as being more of a river fishery because it's right at the mouth of the Chowan River. And this map from the 1860s actually has a typo on it. It calls it Eden House. But Eden House was named, it was really, Eden House is named after Governor Eden. And then Sandy Point in 1814 is the first truly exposed fishery on the Albemarle Sound. It's at Sandy Point, which just sticks right out there, and it's exposed to all the weather. Okay, at the same time, while the fisheries on the Albemarle are starting to take off, the river fisheries are also expanding very rapidly. Joseph Skinner wrote in 1846 about saying that every foothold from the mouth of the Roanoke to Plymouth, where a seine could be hauled, was seized upon and occupied by a seine. Immense quantities of fish were taken for 2 or 3 years by these seines at a profit double that of the Sound fisheries. And this was from 1816 to 1819 that he's talking about. Unfortunately, a lot of these fisheries fall apart in 1819 because of overfishing, and there's just not enough money to go around. Rather than completely blame it on the seine fishermen, they conveniently blame the gillnet fishermen, who were oftentimes didn't have as much accumulated wealth, and so they blamed these other fishermen. So during the Antebellum period, the seine grew in size, particularly on the Albemarle Sound, because of the introduction of horse windlasses. So you had these horse windlasses that would haul in the warps, which are these giant ropes attached to the net, and these windlasses would haul in the warps, and it was usually 6 to 8 windlasses to haul in one seine. And so you see the seines are up to 1,600 to 2,500 yards in length, and if you add the ropes to it, it's going to be about 2.5 miles in length overall. And so they would use two rowboats, 10 to 12 men rowing to put these nets out into the sound. And you could only fit half of the net on one boat and half on the other. And here's a more realistic image of what these boats actually looked like with all the men rowing. And so they would head out from shore to a predetermined location in the sound called the center bush, because you actually had a post sunk out in the sound with a bush tied to it. It's usually a mile offshore. And they would head out to it, and then the landed boat would turn back to shore and pay out the net and the warps. And then the seine boat would usually move parallel to shore for a little ways, while the shad and herring are headed, they're trying to head from the ocean through the sound to the Chesapeake, but they're going to run into the net as they do so. And then the seine boat turns back to shore, and they start to enclose the shad and the herring within this pocket of net. And to get into this business, there's a serious outlay of capital. It was tens of thousands of dollars during that time period just to get into business, which would have been hundreds of thousands of dollars in today's money. And so who worked at these fisheries? Well, you had both free and enslaved peoples. Black men, women, and children were working there. Usually, though, they're looking to employ primarily freed peoples over slaved individuals, because they're going to reserve the slaved individuals for farm labor. And also, you have to consider that there's the possibility of serious injury at these fisheries. There's possibility of drowning, disease, and injury. However, there's also the fear that these enslaved peoples who are rented out to these fisheries aren't under close supervision of their masters, and they're mingling with other freed peoples. And so we have this one quote here. It said, "In the spring, the whole force of the plantation is employed at the fisheries, herring and shad. At these times, there's a great laxity of discipline among the slaves, drunkenness, gambling, and licentiousness prevailing to a most ruinous degree." So they're having fun, and sort of discipline starts to decline, which, if you owned enslaved peoples, that's isn't what you would want ultimately. One of the maritime traditions that arises out of the Antebellum period is that of the fisherman's court. It's kind of like a job fair that took place in the month of February. People would go to the courthouses, and the fisheries owners would negotiate with people terms of employment, wages, that sort of thing. And then people who owned slaves, who wanted to rent out their slaves, would show up, and then they would negotiate prices, terms of employment, how they're going to be treated, that sort of thing. And then once business was concluded, there is usually a big party, lots of drinking and carousing, that sort of thing. And this is a tradition that lasted after the Civil War and well into the 20th century. It eventually, as the fisheries declined, it evolved more into sort of like an agricultural affair that ultimately went out of style in about 1958. And so everyone who's working at these fisheries, they have a very specific role. You have the fishermen who, they're rowing the boats, they're hauling the nets, sometimes they're helping out with sorting the fish. They also tend to be windlass operators, carpenters, coopers, blacksmiths. It's a massive operation, and there's all sorts of jobs available at these fisheries. Women and children were employed as well. They sorted the fish, and they also processed, salted, and packaged them. There's some accounts where the women became so talented and so fast at processing fish, they could process about 30 fish or more in a matter of a minute. There was a clean of fish, I mean. And keep in mind, all of this is incredibly backbreaking labor. These fisheries were operating 24 hours a day, 6 days a week, from early March to early to mid-May. And it was extremely difficult for the men who are actually doing a lot of the rowing and the haulings of the net. They're constantly in the water. The water is often cold, and it would have been easy to have gotten sick. And people were working in shifts, and by the time a shift was over, these people would just sort of collapse in exhaustion. While people were working, I guess to keep themselves entertained, but also to have a rhythm to the work, they would sing. They would sing spiritual songs, jubilee and sorrow songs, as well as traditional work songs, while they're hauling in the nets and processing the fish and rowing the boats. And so the people who worked at these fisheries, they subsided primarily off of yopon tea, which the yopon plant is it's indigenous to North America, and it has a natural caffeine content in the leaves. It's related to the holly plant. They're also given whiskey at the end of each hull of the seine to sort of fortify themselves against the cold. There's a lot of cornbread that was consumed, and they're also eating a lot of herring and a lot of salted pork as well. And so when you see advertisements for these fisheries, when they're being sold or rented out, a lot of times in the descriptions, you'll see mention of the beach being clear of every obstruction, or the beach being perfectly smooth. And what they're talking about is that all the cypress stumps and and the cypress roots and any sort of snags would have been completely cleared out of the water and off of the beach, because you have these massive nets and you don't want to snag a net and tear it, because that's time lost. And so everything has to be perfect ahead of time. And in this region, this is a recent satellite image of the Albemarle Sound and some of its tributaries, but it's bordered by cypress swamp. And cypress grows from the land and into the water, and it's everywhere. And in order to clear a beach, because there's very few naturally occurring beaches in that region, if you want to have a fishery, you have to clear the water and the land yourself. And during this period, they would have used enslaved divers, skin divers, who would have dove down and planted explosives below cypress stumps and root systems, and they would have detonated the explosives. If they didn't loosen the stump up, they would do it again and again until it was loose enough to put a windlass or winch down there to remove the stump and the roots. And these enslaved divers are somewhat unusual because their treatment was because they were said to have been rewarded with whiskey and some money to keep them motivated to work, because they're constantly getting sick with fevers that would cause all sorts of shakes. So I'm not sure what type of fevers. Could have been something like malaria. And then you had the Spool Fishery is a good example of one of these fisheries. It's located on the Chesapeake River, and it had a seine that was 2,000 yards in length, and they're hauling it 4 hours a day. So it took 6 hours to haul the seine each time. And massive labor force, not sure how many people were involved, but just to operate on a day-to-day basis, they had to spend $50 to $100 per day. So thousands of dollars in today's money. And just to kind of give you an idea of the extent of these fisheries, I'm going to throw some census data at y'all. In 1840, we don't know how many fisheries existed, but there's, nearly 1,500 people involved. And from other points in the 1840s, we know there's 20-some fisheries that existed. But by 1850, there's 54 fisheries in the Albemarle Sound, and a lot of people are working at them. And there's a lot of money being spent and a lot of money being made. And then the Senate report to North Carolina Senate in 1852 said that now it's asserted that 70 seines of the largest class and thousands of nets are constantly worked in the sounds in Chesapeake River. So there might have been as many as 70 seines in the 1850s, and so this probably would have been the height of the fisheries in this area during the Antebellum period. And then in 1860, it drops down to 13 fisheries, and not nearly as many people working at them. And so, what happened to all the fisheries? Edmund Ruffin, writing in 1861 about the fisheries, wrote, "Since so many fisheries have been established that the products and profits of each one has, in latter years, been greatly diminished." In other words, there's overfishing going on. There's too many fisheries, and there's not enough fish to go around, and there's not enough profits to go around. So a lot of these fisheries either ceased operation or simply went out of business. So I think now might be a good time to take some questions. Do you have anything, Christine?
I don't appear to have any. Let me check Let me see. I think Cindy's checking our Facebook page right now. So we'll just wait 1 second and see if anybody has anything, a comment or a question. No, I think you're apparently answering everybody's questions as you go along.
Okay.
Yeah, Cindy said there's no new questions or comments on Facebook at this point. So
cool. So we're going to now talk about the Civil War, 1861 to 1865. And during this time period, the fisheries, they go dormant in North Carolina because the war is going on. You have particularly because you have the Union Navy and the Union Army have overtaken, or they're sort of in control of the northeastern part of the state. You've got a garrison, you have Union garrison and naval presence in Plymouth, North Carolina, and Washington County. You've also have Union forces just constantly in and out of the area. A lot of guerrilla warfare is going on as well between Union and Confederate guerrillas, because this part of the state is extremely divided over the issue of secession. However, so the Union Navy particularly wants to deny Confederate forces the ability to obtain fish, because armies need fish, or they need food simply just to stay active out in the field, and they're hoping to starve the Confederacy into submission. And so seines are confiscated, boats are either confiscated or destroyed. Some fisheries are even burned. Some of the fishermen are in prison. There's Blunt Griffin, who had a fishery on the Roanoke River near Plymouth, North Carolina. He was arrested on suspicion of being a secessionist and providing fish to the Confederacy. He was completely innocent, it turned out, but they decided to keep him in prison for a little while just to sort of scare people in the region that they shouldn't defy the Union military. And this image is of Lieutenant Commander Flusser, who was based out of Plymouth, North Carolina, Union naval commander, who was in charge, actually, a lot of these raids that took place on fisheries in small towns in the region. And then we have this newspaper article right here that talks about Yankee gunboats going up the Chowan River and destroying seines and fisheries. But it also mentions this oath of allegiance that they're trying to make the fishery owners take, that I have highlighted here. And what they're referring to is the Union said, we'll allow some fisheries to operate on a limited basis. However, they have to pledge allegiance to the United States, and then they'll get to operate on a limited basis. But they'll also be provided with salt to preserve their fish, because salt is being denied to some of these civilian, or it's being heavily controlled at least. And then by February 1864, there's a limited fishing that's allowed in the region. However, there's constraints placed. The Union military said that civilians could not stockpile more than 10 barrels of fish per household and no more than 100 barrels of fish in a 7-mile radius. I have no idea how they would have regulated or controlled this, but the idea was that if people were stockpiling too much fish, It was going to tempt either Confederate guerrillas or the Confederate Army to conduct raids into this part of the state to try and obtain food resources. And so they were trying to deter this by limiting how much fish people could accumulate. In April of 1864, you had the Battle of Plymouth, which took place in Washington County. Plymouth had a Union garrison and a naval presence, as I mentioned. It came under siege by the Confederate Army, and then the Confederate ironclad, CSS Albemarle, joined in the battle, ran the Union Navy out of the Roanoke River, and the town eventually fell to Confederate forces. It was a hope, the Confederacy hoped that continued victories in the region would allow them to reopen the fisheries of that Albemarle Sound, because it's one of the most important fishing grounds in the Southeast during this time period. However, this never came to fruition due to the Battle of the Albemarle Sound, which took place shortly after the Battle of Plymouth. The Federal Navy went to battle with the CSS Albemarle, and they damaged the Albemarle and forced it to return to Plymouth, never to leave the Roanoke again. And so the Federal Navy, Union Navy, retained command of the Albemarle Sound. Unfortunately, due to the Civil War and all the violence that took place within the southern shore of the Albemarle Sound, Washington and Terrell counties were completely devastated. Their fisheries were destroyed. And prior to the Civil War, Washington and Terrell counties had some massive fisheries that were very profitable, just as profitable as that of Chowan and Bertie County, which really wound up dominating the fisheries. And these same fisheries were never rebuilt in these two counties because the area was just so financially devastated that no one could afford to reestablish them. And so things like gill netting became popular on the lower portion of the Sound. There is, however, a silver lining to all of this. As I mentioned, prior to the Civil War, the shad and herring populations were in decline due to overfishing. But because the fisheries had gone dormant, these populations were allowed to make a comeback. So if there's any questions, I'll take those now. We good?
I'm not seeing any. I'm just waiting for Cindy to let me know from Facebook real quick if there's any comments there. And then but I haven't seen any come through on the Zoom chat yet.
Okay. Will.
So I think, yes, I think you are good to go. Thank you.
All right. So now we're going to get into Reconstruction in the New South, sort of the latter portion of the 19th century. And so in the years following the Civil War, there starts to be some innovation in these fisheries. In 1869, Peter Warren is awarded a patent called steam enginery for seine hauling. And basically what they did was they took these horse windlasses and they applied steam power to them. In fairness, these windlasses actually got a lot bigger, and so the seines got bigger too. But this is an engine house that has one of these steam-powered windlasses in it. And this is what it actually looked like inside. This is where the rope was going to get wrapped around, and you had two of these engine houses that would have towed these seines back into shore. And so then in 1879, Peter Warren also brought steam-powered flatboats into the fisheries. So people started to do away with these big rowboats that required 12 men per boat, and now they started using these steamboats, which only used a handful of men per boat. So you're able to do this a lot faster with these steam engines. On the land and at sea, you go from 4 hauls per day to 6 hauls. So things are getting faster and more efficient with the fishing. And then you also start to see improvements in transportation. In 1869, the Albemarle and Chesapeake Canal is completed. This links the Albemarle Sound all the way to Norfolk and the Chesapeake Bay. So now people are able to take their fish, pack it on ice, take it to Edenton, put it on a steamboat, and send it up to Norfolk, to Richmond, to Baltimore, to other markets where they can make more money and do business on a more regular basis. Then in 1881, Edenton is linked to the Norfolk Southern Railroad, and all of a sudden, people who have these iced shad, they're packed in boxes, they can put it on a train and they can get their fish to New York City in about 24 hours. So things are getting a lot faster now. It's opening up more markets. So you've got New York, Baltimore, Philadelphia, Chicago, some of the western states you can reach out to now, other southern states. So there's more money to be made now that the transportation's become more efficient. So this sets up the industrialization of the fishing in the Albemarle region. And because you have all these steam engines and steam flats involved, fishing becomes more and more expensive, and it becomes dominated by a handful of families, primarily in Bertie and Chowan counties. So the northern and the western shore of the Albemarle Sound. So let's talk about fishing the seine in more depth, because I think with all these innovations, it's warranted. So your seine during this time period ranges from 24 to 2,700 yards in length, massive nets. Then you have your warp, which is your heavy rope that's attached to the ends of your seine that feeds into those windlasses that tows the seine back to shore. It's imported Russian hemp they're using, 1.25 inches in diameter and 1,600 to 1,900 yards in length. So when they're fishing this, they'd start off with 2 of these steam flats. Half the nets and ropes go on one boat, half go on the other. The big difference here is that before they head offshore, they're going to go stern to stern with the ends of the nets hanging off, and then they go out to the center bush together, one stern to stern, one's going all head forward, and then the one's following in reverse. And then this is what the center bush looks like: a pole with a bush tied onto it. That predetermined spot out in the Sound, and at nighttime they'd hang a lantern there so they could see it at night. Okay, and then just as I mentioned previously, you've got your landed boat. It heads back to shore first. Steamboat goes parallel for a distance. Everyone's putting out their nets, and then finally the end boat heads back to shore. Then once they've paid out all their net and their warp, a guy from each boat would go to shore, wade in with the warp, and hand it off to these steam engines on shore, these steam-powered windlasses here and here. And then they would start to tow the seine back into shore. And ultimately, they want to land it right here at this fish house in the middle. And so you'd have these guys at these engine houses, sometimes they're referred to as reelers. They made sure that as the warp is being wound in by the windlass, they're using these poles to make sure that the warp is going on evenly. Because if it doesn't go on evenly, the rope can get jammed, and then they've got to stop what they're doing and undo the jam and the tangles. And then, so you have to imagine you've got tons of rope, you've got this massive seine, 24 to 2,700 yards in length, and you've got to land it in a small area that's about 100 feet wide. And so you also have to, these engine houses are hundreds of yards away from your fish house where you're going to land the net. And in order to sort of tighten the enclosure, to get really a sort of U-shape with the net, they're going to use a system of sheave blocks where, as the ropes are being wound in, they're transferring the rope to different sheave blocks, which focus the net and give it more shape as it's coming in. And then, so I don't have a picture or diagram for this, but ultimately when you're getting close to, when you have the ends of the net get to shore, you wind up having this U shape. And right here, you kind of see that there's a bit of a U shape going on. And then this area over by the fish house, this is called the battery, where they would land the fish. And you've got this massive net, but you've got to be able only to, you have to concentrate the fish into a small area and only land a small part of the net. And to do that, they're going to use something called a toggle line, which it's a line that ran parallel to the lead line. And I've got a diagram for this to help illustrate what I'm talking about. And in the middle, you've got your toggle line splices into the lead line, and that's called the wet foot. But then everything else is attached to the lead. The toggle line is attached to the lead line everywhere else at 40-foot intervals with toggles. And so here's what I'm talking about. You've got this big net on top. You've got your cork line that has all your corks, provides flotation for it. Then you've got your mesh. And then you've got your lead line right here that has the lead weights that hold the net down as it's moving through the water. Then you have your toggle line right here. And in the middle, it's spliced into the lead line. And then I've got what looks like hoops right here. That's where your toggles are that tie it in to keeps that line attached to the rest of the net. And so they would, once they would land, get the ends of the net to the beach, and you have that U shape, they would detach the warps, those big heavy ropes that are towing the seine back in the shore, and they start working the toggle line, and they'd feed the toggle line into a horse windlass and start winding that in. As it's being wound in, they start untying the toggles down here at the bottom of the net. And so what that does is that releases the tension on sections of the net, but maintains the tension everywhere else on the net. And so by untying these toggles and reducing that tension, you can start to peel away sections of net, just kind of fold it back. And you do that more and more and more, and you're getting rid of net essentially, and you're able to focus the fish into a smaller and smaller area. And so you think of your U shape, but that net is getting smaller and smaller and smaller until finally you're down to your wet foot, that area where the toggle line is spliced into the lead line. And that's where people are going to grab on to the net and start to haul it in manually with their hands. And so here in this picture, that's exactly what those guys are doing. They've got this last section of the net where that wet foot is. They're hauling it in. And as you can see, the U shape to the net has gotten a lot smaller. And then off the side, you have all this extra net that has no tension on it. And so you focus the fish into a small area. All the while, you've got steam flat in the background, and they've been taking all that extra net that doesn't have any tension on it anymore, and they're putting it back on the steam flat. And then this is what it looks like when they're finally landing the haul with all the fish. And this area is called the battery, and you have this trapdoor, this little platform that drops down into the water, and when they land the fish, it pops back up, or they lift it back up, so there aren't any fish that flop or roll out and back into the water. And from there, they start to shovel and sort the fish, and then the women go to work cleaning and processing the fish over here. And once the shad are cleaned, they pack them on ice, they box them up, and the herring is salted, and sometimes it's packed in boxes or barrels as well. And while all this is taking place, they're reloading these steam flats with the seine. They're tying that toggle line back on, and they're landing the warps, or putting the warps back on there. And they're going to do this a total of 6 times in a day. And it's going to take 24 hours to do this, and it's taking place 6 days a week. The only day they're not going to do this is Sunday. And so here's a description of one of these large landings that takes place. at one of the fisheries owned by it's one owned by Dr. Capehart in Bertie County, Evoca. It says nearly 200,000 herring have been brought in at one haul of the seine. The pile, when on the dock, measured 80 feet long, 22 feet wide, 2 feet deep. For comparison's sake, the fish would have filled 20 coal cars. So just to sort of give you an idea of how much fish was being landed. Now, up until 1869, these seines are pretty dominant. Then in 1869, John Hetrick, who's originally from the Lake Erie area of Pennsylvania and Ohio, he moved down to Chowan County and he introduced the pound net to North Carolina. It's a stationary net that it's pretty cheap, it's inexpensive, it doesn't require a lot of intensive labor, and it can be fished anywhere. You don't have to have a special cleared beach. You can fish it up right against the cypress swamp if you want to. But essentially what happens, the fish, they would run into a wall of net. They want to get around it, so they follow it all the way down. Then they go into a section called the heart, which then leads into a section called a funnel or a tunnel, which puts them in the pound where they become trapped and they're alive until they're fished out by a fisherman. In 1878, John Hetrick's brother William joined him, and business takes off, and these nets become extremely popular, and they proliferate throughout the Albemarle Sound, its tributaries, and elsewhere in eastern North Carolina. And because of this, because the nets are so much cheaper and easier to fish, a lot more people are able to get into commercial fishing. And so you have like your middle and working class people are able to join in. And so these people who had these huge seine fisheries, they were the wealthy landed gentry in the region. And now they're coming up against stiff competition from sort of the everyday working man. And this caused conflict. There was lawsuits that took place where seine fishermen against pound net fishermen. You had laws passed to try and protect these seine fisheries. And anytime around elections in the area, it was a politically contentious issue. And so here's a summary from the Weekly Economist of this sort of issue. They said, the Weekly Economist is a newspaper out of Elizabeth City, wrote, there has been considerable feeling against Dutch nets or pound nets because they break down the monopoly of fishing. Fished with 1/5 the expense, they can afford to reduce the price of fish and bring them within the reach of all persons. They called pound nets Dutch nets sometimes because the Hetricks were of Pennsylvania Dutch heritage. But here's an example of what they talk about by cutting down the price. So prior to the introduction of the pound net, herring was going for $5 per 1,000. Then after the pound net became popular, it was going for $2.50 per 1,000. So that's really cutting down on the profit margins for these large seine fisheries, and which really helps illustrate why there's so much angst about the pound net. And due to increased competition, more efficient gear coming into play, like the pound net, in the 1890s, these seine fisheries go into decline. And it's really just comes down to, a handful of families by the turn of the century. And so the pound net actually becomes so popular and so numerous that out in the close to the Outer Banks, or by the Outer Banks, Oregon Inlet is said to have been just jammed full of these pound nets, as well as Croatan Sound and Roanoke Sound. And so the shad and the herring, they would come through Oregon Inlet and go up through the either Croatan or Roanoke Sounds, and then move over into the Albemarle and its tributaries. But because of all these pound nets, the fish couldn't get there. So a law was passed in 1905 to control how many nets were in the area and to make sure they weren't blocking the inlets and the waterways leading to the Albemarle and other places. In all fairness, they also regulated these pound nets and fisheries in the Albemarle region. So here, this map is of the Chowan River, and it shows the limits for these pound nets, and it shows a channel is marked that has to be clear for the fish to move through. And then this is a map from 1906 showing the results of the Van Law. and it shows these things that look like little trees coming off the shore. These are pound nets. And see, there's tons of pound nets, and these little black dots are the last few seine fisheries. And so there's 3 on the Albemarle Sound, and then you've got several down around the mouth of the Roanoke and the Gashie rivers. And then over here in Croatan Sound and the upper portion of the Pamlico Sound, more sort of pound nets shown right there. And so these fisheries, again, go dormant when World War I rolls around. By the time the United States joins World War I, there's only one large seine operation left on the Albemarle Sound, and that's the Evoca Fishery, owned by the Capehart family in Bertie County. And it, like I said, it goes dormant. And because there's no fishermen, there's no men there to take care of the fishery. It just things start to fall apart, especially those steamboats that are used, those steam flats, and they become so rotted out that they're never again used in the fisheries. In the 1920s and 1930s, they tried to revive the seine fishery at Evoca in Bertie County. It just doesn't really work out. They do use gasoline boats pulling pontoons, and they're fishing these seines much in the same way they had been with the steam flats. But the Great Depression winds up getting in the way, and it pushes this fishery under, largely because the Capehart family winds up losing their farm and their fishery due to the Great Depression. However, seining continued on the Roanoke River up through the 30s and 40s. By the time the 1950s roll around, there's only really one large seine fishery left on the Roanoke, and it goes out of business by either late 50s, early 60s. And it's not quite as sophisticated. They're not using as many steam windlasses, or a lot of them are hand turned. A lot of the labor is taking place by hand. A lot of great photos. And then the reason why these seine fisheries ultimately go out of business, they go out of fashion, sort of, because, like I mentioned earlier, there's cheaper and more efficient gear to go fish with. There's pound nets and there's gill nets, and there's other forms of gear and to go fishing with. That's just more efficient, cheaper. And so the pound nets, they still are used largely in the herring fishery and the rock fish as well, and perch. But one of the problems, though, is with the shad. There's all sorts of issues. One of being reduced water quality in the region on the rivers because of industrial waste. You have the rise of paper and wood pulp mills in the region, and there's industrial effluents that's getting in there. And shad are really sensitive to water quality. And if there's, say, too much agricultural runoff or industrial waste, they won't head up the rivers. And they'd known about the issue of water quality for a long time, dating back to Antebellum Period, with agricultural runoff was deterring shad from going deeper and deeper into North Carolina and going up its rivers. Also, it's just you had diminished fish populations. The shad especially had been overfished in the region. And that's pretty much all that I have right now. This is such a huge and rich topic. I could go deeper, but I just don't have enough time. So let me know if there's any questions.
It does not appear that we have any additional questions at this time. So, all quiet on Facebook.
Gotcha.
Thank you.
Yeah. So thank you all for tuning in and watching. See you next time. The next talk is going to be on April 13th at 11 a.m. And it's going to be given by Keith Rittmaster. And he's going to be talking about whales in North Carolina. And it's going to be available via Zoom and Facebook Live. So check in again on April 13th at 11 a.m. for Keith's talk on whales. And so if there's not any questions, see you all later.